Hey, thanks for checking out my video. I'm Olivia, and today I'm going to talk about my grungy spring palettes. So a few days ago, I was going through my makeup collection and I was swapping out my eyeshadow palettes. Just because I have a much larger collection, I tend to kind of swap them out on a seasonal basis, and that way it's easier for me to grab for things that I'm more likely to reach for and more inspired to reach for during certain times of the year. That's why I often swap my makeup out. I tend to be inspired by the seasons. So when I think of spring palettes, there's a couple different vibes I tend to go for. I'm thinking light washes of color or pastels. I'm thinking soft neutrals, and then I'm thinking specific color combos. Very much like the green and pink type of combo, a lot like what I'm wearing today. Which, by the way, if you're curious about this look, I did film this for an upcoming video, and it was actually supposed to be a grungy spring look, and I'm using one of the palettes that I'll talk about today. So if that's something you're interested in, just keep an eye out for that video. But yeah, those kind of tend to be the types of palettes that I reach for around this type of the year. So as I was going through my collection and reaching for palettes that gave me that vibe, I realized that there was a good handful of palettes that did fall into those categories, but there was something a little bit different or like extra about them. And they still gave me the spring vibes, but they were also grungy at the same time. So I thought it'd be fun to kind of put those palettes aside and talk about them in a video. So I actually have a lot to talk about today. I tried to organize them into different groups. These are very, I guess, loosely placed in the groups because overall they give grungy spring. They are pretty similar. But I did feel like there were a few that gave the grungy spring aesthetic for different reasons. Again, most of these kind of fall into all the groups. But the first kind of group that I put together were palettes that have a spring type of color story. But the shades might be a little bit more muted, a little bit deeper. It's a bit more of like a moody palette. That's kind of the first group. The second group's a lot smaller, but the second group is palettes that maybe don't necessarily give off spring as soon as you open it, but the more you look at the color story, maybe there's a part of the palette or certain pops that do kind of fit the grungy spring theme. I hope that's not like too much of a stretch, but it made sense in my brain. Again, I feel like most of the palettes can kind of fit across the categories, but I still want to organize it this way. And then for the third group of palettes, those are mostly like true spring color stories. They're either pastels or like the light wash of color, but the aesthetic of the actual palette is a little bit more grungy. It's a little different. I thought that would still be worth mentioning, even though they are more of your typical spring palette. Like if you looked at the color story, they are very spring. But if you look at the palette as the whole and the packaging, it still gives off that type of energy. I hope that makes sense. But let's just get into the palettes. And again, this first group are palettes that do have that color story. There's just something a little bit darker, moodier, grungier about these palettes. Like I said, there's quite a bit here, so I'm going to go through them pretty quickly because I'm going to be very redundant as well. They're all in this group or all in this video, basically for the same reasons. So I'll go pretty quickly. I do also want to mention, I feel like the majority of these palettes are indie, which to me isn't that surprising. I feel like indie brands do tend to be a little bit riskier or more daring with their color stories. They do tend to offer more unique options. So yeah, not really a huge surprise in my opinion, but there are a couple mainstream ones as well. I'm going to start with a palette that I feel like just really exemplifies like grungy spring. And to me, that's going to be the Cosmic Beauty Muse palette. Also, I'm well aware the palettes I'm going to talk about, you would probably consider more of a fall palette, and I definitely see that too. I feel like if I did a palettes for fall type of video, a lot of these palettes can fall in that category as well. But I also feel like that makes sense because I'm going for a grungy spring, and to me, fall palettes tend to be grungy. So there's definitely going to be a lot of overlap, so please don't yell at me in the comments. I'm well aware. But anyway, I did want to include the Muse palette. A color combination you're going to see a lot in this video is like greens and pinks or maybe some lavenders. Those colors together to me really feel like spring. So this palette is a great example. It's a little bit grungier with some of the deeper shades here and some of the darker shimmers even. But because it does have those like lighter pops like this pink here, the lavender, and the mint, to me this is like a perfect example of a grungy spring palette. I also have the Secret Grove palette by Gourmand Girls. Again, I'll try not to be too repetitive, but a lot of these palettes, it's going to be like a green-pink combo. That's what this palette gives too. The brighter pops still make it a very spring palette, but obviously you have some of the grungy, swampier greens. A really cool, like a deeper duochrome or multichrome here. So there's a lot of interest in this palette. It's definitely not like a one-note, bright spring palette. You can really bring the drama with this one. Funny enough, this one is almost a similar theme, but this is the Pixie Grove by It's Belle. And again, definitely could work for fall, but I think this also really gives grungy spring vibes. I'm loving the deeper shades, the swampy green, but then the bright pop of like mint and this really bright kind of saturated orange. I feel like this is just a really good palette if you're going for that type of a look. And the shimmers are really interesting and shifty as well. I do really love this palette. I hope its Belle comes back. I feel like she was taking a break, but it sounded like she was planning on returning at some point. Either way, this is a great palette. Next, I have the High Times palette by Midas. I'm pretty sure I have actually included this in a fall palettes video, or if not, I've definitely thought about it. But this is very similar to the Pixie Grove palette I just showed you. You have some orange, some peachy tones, and then the bright greens. This side of the palette is definitely a little bit more like dingy and muted, and I feel like that's where you really get the grunge. And even the peachy, like orange shades in this palette, they still look almost a little bit dirty, but like in the best way. So yeah, I wanted to include the High Times palette. This one might be a little bit more of a stretch, but I have the Nubian 3 Coral by Juvia's Place. Obviously, the coral aspect of the palette is really what's giving me the spring vibes, but I feel like pairing them with the grays and then the really rich browns here is kind of what makes it a little more exciting. In my opinion, it kind of moves this palette away from like your standard spring palette, and it makes it just a little bit more interesting. You can go a lot darker and a little bit grungier with this one. Do not take a shot every time I say the word grungy in this video. That'd be dangerous. Next, I have what is absolutely also a fall palette in my opinion. This is the Gemini 2 from Melt. I feel like this palette was notorious for getting molds, so I actually removed the 2 shimmers from mine because I noticed them getting moldy within like months of getting this palette. So that was really upsetting, but I didn't want to get rid of this palette because the mattes are so beautiful and I do really love the colors they offer as well. So I wanted to keep it around. But I do think this palette is also a really good example of like a grungy spring color story. Again, you have the deeper rich tones here with some lighter peachier shades, and that's just like the perfect combo for a grungy spring look. This one also might be a little bit of a stretch, but I feel like that's the fun of these types of videos. A lot of these palettes can fall under different areas of inspiration, if that makes sense. For example, the Lethal is Dead palette by Lethal Cosmetics and Teresa's Dead. I actually had this one pulled for my winter rotation of palettes, but when I was going through my collection again for spring, I felt like this color story still worked really well for this idea. I feel like it has all of those spring colors. So you have a green, you have a bright yellow, a pink, a lavender, but they're all a little bit muted and just a little bit darker. So it's not the most vibrant, bright green and lavender. They're almost toned down and like darkened just a touch. And I feel like that's what makes this such a unique, beautiful palette for the spring, but also really like year round, clearly, as I was using this for the winter. This next one's actually from my basket of shame. I have not used it yet, and I'm embarrassed about it. But this is the Salem Cosmetics and Smink collab. I'm not really sure how to pronounce her whole name. I think she's a Swedish influencer. I might be wrong about that. I do follow her on Instagram though. Really beautiful content. And of course, she did this collab with Salem Cosmetics. This is the Forest Heart palette. And again, it's giving that same color combo I've been kind of talking about. It has a bunch of different greens here, some really unique kind of pinky shades, and then again, a more muted orange instead of something really poppy. So I feel like this side of the palette is definitely giving spring, and then this side almost has like spring colors, but muted and darker. So because of that, I felt like this was a perfect example of a grungy spring palette. I'm also very curious to know if you guys have any of these palettes that I'm talking about, especially because a lot of them are indie, and I never actually know how popular indie makeup is. I feel like there's a lot of beauty influencers that talk about the indie brands, but I'm always curious to know how popular some of these releases actually are. I mean, clearly I bought into them, but I'm also a little bit of a makeup hoarder, so I don't know if that's the norm. So I actually have 2 mainstream palettes that I wanted to mention in this video. Both of these were actually included in my palettes for spring video that I did last year, but I felt like they still fit this theme as well. This one maybe a little less, but it's the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. This one obviously is like your classic spring palette. There's the soft neutrals, the peachy tones, there's like a lighter sage green. It's just like a kiss of color, but I still want to include it because I feel like the deeper shades here could still give you that grungy effect for your makeup look. Now that I'm looking at this palette, I think what it is too is mixing like the warm tones and the cool tones. And you do have some warmer tones here, but this one's more of a cool tone purple. There's a cool tone brown and then almost like a charcoal shade. And I feel like that adds an element of interest. There's a little bit of contrast from like the soft warm tones here. And I think that's also what's kind of contributing to palettes feeling potentially grungy in my opinion. So yeah, I did want to include this palette. Also mentioned in my palettes for spring video last year was the ABH and Norvina palette. This to me, definitely very spring, but I think it's the addition of like these 5 shades here that can make this lean a little bit grungier. Again, you have this like kind of deeper mustard yellow, which to me feels like more of a fall shade. This one's a little bit more of a burgundy. There's a deep kind of cooler tone purple here. And then we have a slightly cooler tone taupey shade here. And I think the contrast of those shades against like the softer pinks, the purple and the creamy shades really are what makes this palette interesting and gives you the option to go grungy. So yeah, I wanted to include the Norvina palette. All right, there's a few more palettes in this little category that I created. This next one I feel like could honestly work as a year-round palette. It offers a lot in the way of color and also variation in depth, but it's the Blend Bunny All Done Up palette. Obviously, looking at the color story, this whole section makes me think of fall more than it does spring, but for this palette, I think it's the addition of these brighter shades up here. I don't know if I would necessarily call these pastels. This one feels pretty close, but there's a bright blue, there's this brighter yellow, this kind of peachy pink here. This isn't quite a lavender, it's almost like a periwinkle. So again, I feel like this palette could really work in the fall, even in the winter, but I think because of the brightness that it offers in the top row, it does feel like a spring palette to me, and obviously a spring palette that you can go very grungy with. The next one I wanted to mention, I also feel like is a perfect example of like a grungy spring palette, and it's the Beauty Bay Botanical palette. I feel like I said that weird, but I also tried 3 different times, so that's the last take. But yeah, just like all the other palettes, I feel like the color story is very spring. This palette offers greens, pinks, there's kind of this purpley shade here, but the color story is still a little bit muted, a little bit desaturated, so I feel like it does fall into the grungy spring category pretty well because of that. I've only used this palette once or twice so far, but I do feel like it really gives that range. Especially with the brighter pops here, you really could stick to the lighter shades and get a truly spring look. But overall, this palette does offer a lot more than that, and I've really liked the looks that I've created so far. All right, we have 2 palettes left in this little category. The next one is the Gimme Glow Vintage Rose. This one might be of a stretch because looking at it, it is definitely a very spring palette in my opinion. I did feel like it could still qualify for this video really because of these 2 shades. Because the green's not necessarily like a super bright, punchy green, I wouldn't call it a forest green either, but it's leaning a little bit in that direction. It's a little bit of a darker green. And same with this shimmer, it's not super bright and punchy. It's a little bit more moody. You're gonna get something a little bit smokier if you use that one. Plus there's like a deeper burgundy shade. So even though it's definitely a spring palette, I think you can absolutely get super grungy looks with it if you incorporate 1 or more of these shades here. And the last palette in this little category, also from the Basket of Shame, don't at me, but this is gonna be the Fantasy Cosmetica Ranger palette. I feel like I really don't need to give an explanation. This is very much like the Pixie Grove that I talked about earlier too, but it has like the perfect combination of like kind of these peachy oranges and then the greens, and again, that combination to me feels very spring. But because they're a little less bright, I mean, maybe minus this shade, but because some of the shades are on the darker side, like these 3, and even this peachy orange isn't like the brightest, punchiest peachy orange, I feel like it does give me the grungy vibes as well. All right, so for the next category, this is definitely a smaller group of palettes, and this one might be a little bit more like controversial in a sense, because when I look at these palettes initially, I don't immediately think spring, grungy spring, this is it. I feel like these palettes give me a different type of vibe initially, but then something about it, maybe just 1 or 2 pops, does make me feel like I can get like a grungy spring look from it. I hope that makes sense. But the first one I'm going to talk about is the Celestial Garden palette. And this was a collab between M. Jones and Bella Beauté Bar. Now, like I said, I feel like most of these palettes really can kind of fit into all the categories. For example, this one still does have like the combination of like the green, pink, purple, so it does still have those springy colors. Something about it doesn't initially give me the spring vibes, but then the more I look at it, the more I feel like I could achieve a look that kind of falls in that category. I think it's because of like the really bright teal here, this really shimmery purple, and then obviously these 3 shades. You definitely can get that brightness and the color combos that give you something more spring. Honestly, I feel like the more I look at it, the more it actually does fit in that first category because these are definitely spring colors. They're just a little bit more unique in tone. And even like these columns here offer a little bit more depth. So I mean, maybe this is kind of like a bridge between the first and second category. I will admit I've never used the liners that come in this palette. Honestly, I'd kind of like to. I feel like these colors would be really perfect to use in a little spring-inspired eye look. The next palette I have is from Lethal Cosmetics. Unfortunately, at least for their older palettes, they never include the name. I feel like this is called like the Evergreen. I might be wrong though. This palette might be a better example of this category, whereas to me, like when I first look at it, it definitely feels like a fall palette. Again, because of the deeper, kind of dirtier greens, the darker but like vibrant purple. These shimmers, again, will give you something smoky. But I still felt like it fit in the video, probably mostly because of the top row. It does offer a little bit of brightness. And I feel like if you paired one of these 3 shades with any of the darker shades, or like even this quad alone, I feel like would give you the grungy spring vibe that I'm trying to talk about. I feel like I should rename this category of palettes that I'm talking about to like fall palettes that give me spring. Because I feel like that's what these are. But the next one I wanted to talk about was the Come As You Are palette from Carity. I don't know if Carity is still around making makeup anymore, but this was always one of my favorite palettes that they came out with. Like a lot of the other ones that I mentioned in this video, it's definitely giving grungier kind of fall vibes, but I think it's the pairing of the green with the orange and the peachy shade. There's some brighter yellows and some rosier tones up here. You can definitely achieve a grungy spring look with this palette. If I remember, I'll actually post a photo on the screen of a look I did with this palette. Although it's not the best quality, it's not the most impressive look I've done, something about it I was just so happy with, and honestly to this day, it's like one of my favorite looks that I've done. Again, I don't think it's because of like the quality or the cool shimmers, like these are very lackluster, but I was just really happy with how the color combination came out, and thinking back, that was definitely a grungy spring look. I'm also wondering if I'm just like rewording what like a fall palette means to me. Because all these palettes are like certain combos, but like muted and have more depth. And I feel like that's also what makes a palette suitable for fall. Is this video a sham? Anyway, I wanted to include this one in the video because again, even though it kind of gives the fall vibes, it's a very grungy spring palette in my opinion. Similarly, we have the Moonshroom by Lunar Beauty. Again, in my opinion, very fall palette. But the addition of this bright lavender, the bright yellow here, and even like this kind of mustardy yellow, I feel like it gives this palette a little bit of whimsy. The shimmers in it are also really pretty, maybe except for like these two, they're not super grungy. This one feels a little bit more ethereal to me. These ones are a little bit on the brighter side. So like I said, even though this to me is a very fall palette, I definitely think it leans into the grungy spring vibe as well. And I love this one, it's so cute. I also wore this one when I got engaged, so it's got a special little place in my heart. This last palette honestly kind of falls into all 3 categories. And again, not to be repetitive, but like I said, I feel like all the palettes kind of overlap. They all kind of give that same vibe. I don't know if grouping into categories was a need, but I felt like doing it at the time. But this one's going to be the Gloomy Garden palette by Diveroon Cosmetics. Diveroon Cosmetics. So personally, because of like the dinginess of the colors, like again, the kind of dirtier green, the slightly more muted like purple and lavender here, and then the gray tones, when I open this kind of gives me like fall going into winter vibes. But also like the first group of palettes, a lot of the color combos are very spring at the same time. And honestly, I think the main thing that makes me feel that way is this column of peachy shades. Just this little addition of like warmth and brightness, I think kind of pull it in that direction for me. Again, most of the mattes are a little bit dingier, they're a little bit more muted, they're not super saturated, but then you just have this pop of brightness and warmth that I think really makes the palette versatile, and again, in my opinion, makes this palette suitable for pretty much any season. Maybe a little less so summer, but like I said, fall, winter, and even spring, I feel like I'm gonna reach for this one. Also, I feel like the theme in itself is kind of giving that grungy spring aesthetic. I mean, it is called Gloomy Gardens, there's some flowers printed on it, so it does very much lean into that aesthetic. And that's also kind of what defines the last category of palettes that I have here. These last few, I feel like, offer a little bit more of like a true spring color story. They might not necessarily be the grungiest, but the overall aesthetic of the palette, like the packaging, maybe the name of the palette or the names of the shades, that aspect is kind of what made these palettes feel like grungy spring to me. So the first one I'll talk about is the Sugar and Grunge palette by Blend Bunny, and I'm actually wearing this one on my eyes today. As you can see, very spring palette. The whole top row is like brighter pastels. The shimmers too are like lighter washes of color. Even the more vivid colors aren't super grungy, except maybe like these two. But I feel like because of this deeper row and obviously the packaging in itself, this palette really inspires me to create something in the theme of spring, but with an edge. And that is kind of what I tried doing today as well. The next palette I wanted to mention that falls into this category is the Kaleidos Flower Punk palette. This one is like absolutely grungy spring to a T. It's like the perfect combination of colors. You have this bright turquoise here. There's like a green to pink duochrome, a pinky peachy shade, the pinks. It's a very spring palette. But then you have these 4 shades here, and these really take the palette in a totally different direction. This portion of the palette is like very edgy, grungy. Again, you have the dirtier, dingy tones. So I feel like this palette is truly like a grungy spring dream. And then of course with the actual packaging, the flower punk theme, it's obviously meant to be a little bit edgy. It's kind of combining the 2 different themes. And I feel like that's what makes this palette so beautiful. So I have 2 palettes from Shroud. They're kind of the same thing. It's the Creepy Cute and then the Creepy Cute 2. I feel like both of these definitely fit the spring vibe. The original one's definitely a little bit more pastel, but I find that even these pastels are a little bit more interesting. It's not your typical super bright pastel. I don't want to say these are muted, but there's almost something a little bit off with these tones. I just find them to be very interesting, unique shades. Obviously the colors that are in the palette and the fact they're pastels really do make this a spring themed palette. But it's the overall aesthetic of the palette, the whole creepy cute vibe. There's the addition of the gray here called Tombstone. There's a really nice deep black called Void. So it's really like the overall aesthetic of the palette. It's giving me the grungy spring vibe. Creepy Cute 2 is definitely a little bit more vibrant, but also kind of in the same vein. The colors are like bright and punchy, but there's still something like kind of different about the actual tone of them. Again, very unique, and I feel like that's something Shroud did very well. And obviously, Creepy Cute 2, we're still in line with the theme. So I did want to include both of these in this video. I have 3 palettes left, and 2 of them are from Unearthly. So this first one is the Bunnies palette. This one is kind of similar to the ones that I talked about from Shroud. The colors to me are very obviously spring. I wouldn't call these pastels, but they are a lot brighter, and the colors in the palette also kind of fall in line with that theme. But really, again, this category is all about the overall aesthetic. And in my opinion, Unearthly Cosmetics in general just kind of gives that like grungy, edgy vibe. And I feel like most of the palettes they come out with can fall in that grungy kind of category. This one obviously falls into the grungy spring category because of the colors in it. And it's pretty much the same with the Strawberry Milkshake palette by them. Obviously, color stories very spring. Again, I love the combination of the green with the pink. I love the addition of the chartreuse in the middle. I feel like that really adds to the interest of the palette. I'm also biased though, I love a chartreuse. But yeah, this reasoning is kind of the same as the Bunnies palette, just the overall vibe and aesthetic of Unearthly. It's very cool, it's very edgy, it's creative. So I still wanted to include this one in my grungy spring video. Alright, and the last palette in this video, honestly, is probably one of the oldest. I'm very curious, I would love to know if you have this palette, or if you were like around in the beauty space when this palette came out. Definitely, in my opinion, a palette that was a little bit ahead of its time, but this is the Pastel Goth by KVD. This obviously came out when it was still Kat Von D, but definitely fitting for this video. This one's kind of similar to the Shroud palettes. It's like pretty much all pastels with the addition of like a gray here, but something about some of the colors is still a little bit like muted, almost like grayscale pastels. I'm mostly referring to like these shades here that have that sort of effect. I just really love that there's like a contrast between like the bright kind of colorful shades and then some of the names. There's Gloom, Dagger, Skull, and then obviously the name of the palette. I was gonna say this really fits into the gothic spring theme, which honestly still kind of works. But yeah, I thought this one was definitely perfect to fit in my grungy spring video. But yeah, those are all the palettes I want to talk about that gave me that kind of grungy spring color story or aesthetic. I'd love to know what you think, if you agree with me on including all these palettes, or if there's other palettes that I didn't mention that you feel like really fit that kind of theme. Please let me know down below. Atlas is coming to get me now. So I'm gonna have to wrap this up. So we're gonna have to wrap this up because it's actually our scheduled playtime. Yes, it is. Hey. Oh, thank you. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Oh, hi. Oh, thank you. Thank you. What a handsome man. Are you looking at yourself in the mirror? Yes, he is. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much for spending your time watching it, and I'll see you in the next one.